When I'm doing sampling, I also have to be really careful about this thing called bias. Bias is when we have a systematic failure of a sampling method to represent the population, which results in an over or an underestimate of the population parameter. One of the most famous situations of bias has to do with the Literary Digest poll of 1936. They sent out 10 million ballots and got back 2.4 million. That's a huge number of people to participate in something. And the particular thing they were surveying is what the predicted presidential winner would be that year. And up until that point, they had been correct every year that they had done this poll. But this particular year, Roosevelt ended up winning, and the Literary Digest actually shut down within 2 years because of all of the drama that went on after they incorrectly did this. But why did we get 2.4 million people participating and still miss the ball on what this prediction was? It had to do with the fact that they were polling from people who could afford magazines at that time, which is right after Great Depression, and most people can't afford things like a magazine. They pulled from magazines, automobiles, and telephone registries. So your population you're pulling from is significantly different from what the general population was. So first, let's review the population is the total group that we care about knowing something. The parameter is what we want to know about that group. The sample is what we're able to obtain, and the statistic is the thing we're measuring from that sample. So population parameter, sample statistic. It's really important before we do a survey that we define the population. Who do we actually want to know about, so that we make sure we're asking the right people, that we're asking them the right questions, that we're asking them good quality questions, and it really helps to do a pilot study first. The first type of bias I can get is called undercoverage bias, and that's when I just end up totally leaving out a whole part of the population because of how I chose my sample. And so it's often due to it's called a sampling frame, which is the list we're getting our sample from. So like when we did the random numbers earlier, the list I'm using for the random numbers is not complete. So a lot of times using landline home phones is an example of something hardly anyone has a landline phone now, and so people who do have one are probably statistically different than people who do not have it. So it's not a complete sampling frame. Another type of bias is called non-response bias. So that's when you choose someone to be in your sample and they can't be contacted or they refuse to cooperate. So you did do your random sampling, but they don't participate in it. So hanging up when someone calls you to do a poll, they aren't at home, anything like that. Response bias is when something else external would be influencing the responses. So you want to please the interviewer. So say my boss asks me how I think they're doing with their job. Well, I'm going to be motivated to say really good things to protect my job, even though that may not be the truth. That's an extreme situation, but can illustrate what's going on with response bias. Not wanting to answer uncomfortable questions as well, and also wording of a question if I'm giving leading statements, which are really common in just social media and things like that, will have a lot of bad wording and lead to response bias. And the last is using a poor sampling method. So we talked some about convenient sampling and voluntary response sampling. So those naturally lead to different biases when I use those. And so I can't draw valid conclusions because those don't represent my actual population.